She raised a child that wasn't hers, buried a truth that could have saved her, and let an entire town destroy her name. On purpose. 4 years of silence, one dying promise, and the moment a stranger finally dared to ask why. If you've ever been judged for something you didn't do and chose to stay quiet anyway, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The dust came first, the way it always did in Red Hollow. Before the heat, before the noise of wagon wheels scraping against packed earth, before the first rooster finished its complaint about the morning. The dust arrived, rising from the flat Kansas plain like something the land itself was trying to exhale. It coated the storefronts on Main Street in a pale, grayish film, settled on the wooden signs above the bakery and the telegraph office and the feed store, and drifted lazy and indifferent through the single gap between the livery stable and the barber shop where the wind liked to channel itself every morning around 7:30. Miriam Holloway noticed the dust. She noticed everything about Wednesday mornings because Wednesdays were when Mrs. Calloway picked up her dresses, and Mrs. Calloway had a talent for finding something wrong that hadn't been wrong the week before. She stood behind the low wooden counter of her shop, a narrow building wedged between the post office and a shuttered millinery that nobody had rented in going on 3 years, and pressed a seam with the flat of her iron, watching the steam rise and curl and disappear. The shop smelled of pressed cotton and beeswax and the faint cedar of the storage chest in the corner where she kept her good shears. It was a smell she had built over 4 years, thread by thread, customer by customer, the way a bird builds a nest. Not because it's easy, but because there is no other option. The bell above the door chimed at 8 o'clock exactly. "Rose," Miriam said it without looking up. "Close your book and go to the back." A small voice drifted from the corner near the window where the light was best. "I'm only on chapter 3. Chapter 3 will wait. Mrs. Calloway won't." A pause. The sound of pages closing with more drama than was strictly necessary for a 6-year-old. Then small feet on wooden boards, a flash of dark braids and a white pinafore, and the back curtain swaying as Rose disappeared into the workroom. Miriam set her iron aside, smoothed the front of her gray dress. Practical. Well made, the kind of garment that said, "I have standards without saying I have money," and turned to face the door just as Eleanor Calloway pushed it open with her customary energy, which was to say she pushed it like she was annoyed at it for being there. Eleanor Calloway was 61 years old, had been married twice, buried one husband and outlasted the other through sheer determination, and had never in her life, as far as Miriam could tell, said a kind word that wasn't immediately followed by a sharper one. She wore her silver hair in a bun so tight it seemed to be the source of her permanent expression, which was the expression of a woman who had just bitten into something she suspected was off. "Good morning, Mrs. Calloway." "It's hot for October," Eleanor said, which was her version of a greeting. "Yes, ma'am. Your dresses are ready." Miriam lifted 2 garments from the rack behind her, a burgundy wool day dress and a charcoal visiting gown, both sewn with the kind of invisible precision that only came from hands that had been at it since childhood. "I added the extra tuck at the waist on the gray, the way you asked." Eleanor took the gray gown and held it toward the light from the window. She rotated it slowly, the way a judge examines evidence. Miriam waited. She was good at waiting. 4 years of Red Hollow had made her exceptional at it. "The buttons are ivory," Eleanor said finally. "Yes. The ones you selected at Harper's." "I thought they'd be whiter." "They're the buttons you chose, Mrs. Calloway." Eleanor's mouth pressed into a thin line. She set the gown on the counter and turned to look around the shop with the slow deliberateness of a woman who wants you to know she is looking and that whatever she finds, she expected it. "Is that child here?" Miriam kept her voice even. "My daughter is in the back." The word daughter landed in the space between them with the particular weight it always carried in Red Hollow, in conversations with women like Eleanor Calloway. Miriam had learned to say it without flinching. It had taken about 8 months. Eleanor picked up the burgundy dress, inspected a sleeve. "My Henrietta saw her playing outside the schoolyard again yesterday. Says she sits on the fence and watches the other children." She paused as if letting that picture settle. "Alone. Rose is quiet by nature." "Children aren't meant to be quiet by nature." Eleanor laid the dress back down. They're meant to have friends, playmates, mothers who... She stopped herself, which was unusual for Eleanor Calloway. Well, the unfinished sentence occupied the room for a moment. Miriam knew how it ended. She'd heard every possible ending in 4 years. Mothers who hadn't made the choices you made. Mothers the other children's mothers don't warn their daughters about. Mothers the town doesn't talk around in hushed voices at the dry goods store. "How much do I owe you?" Eleanor asked, already opening her purse with the practiced efficiency of a woman who considers payment a transaction and nothing more. $4.20 for both. Money changed hands. Eleanor gathered her garments without the wrapping paper. She never took the wrapping paper, which Miriam had always read as a small signal, a refusal to let it look like a gift, and turned for the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "I'll say this, Miss Holloway." She didn't turn around. "Whatever else anyone says about you, and they say plenty, as you know, you do fine work. I won't argue that." Then she was gone, the bell chiming her exit, and Miriam let out a slow breath through her nose and stood very still for a moment before going to the back of the shop to find Rose. The little girl was sitting on the tall stool beside the cutting table, feet dangling, her book open in her lap again as if it had never closed. She had her mother's eyes, her real mother's eyes, Sarah's eyes, dark and quick, the kind that noticed things before they were said. Rose had always been like that. Even as an infant, she'd had a watchfulness about her that made Miriam feel, sometimes, like the child understood more than she let on. "She gone?" Rose asked without looking up. "She's gone. She always smells like mothballs and judgment." Miriam stopped walking, turned slowly toward the child. "Where did you hear a thing like that?" Rose kept her eyes on her book. "I made it up." "Rose?" "Mrs. Tanner said it to Mrs. Phelps outside the mercantile. I was on the steps." She finally looked up, completely unrepentant. "I only agreed with it." Miriam sat down on the stool across from her and pressed her fingers against her forehead for a moment. The girl was 6. She was going to be a problem. The interesting kind, the kind that kept you on your toes. And Miriam was simultaneously dreading and mildly proud of it. You shouldn't repeat what grown women say in private conversation. Were they trying to be private? They were using their regular voices. "Rose." "Yes, ma'am." A silence. Outside, a horse stamped on the packed earth of the street. Somewhere down the block, the blacksmith's hammer started up its morning rhythm. "Did you eat the biscuit I left on the windowsill?" "Half of it." "Eat the other half." "It got dry." "I know it got dry. Eat it anyway." Rose slid off the stool with a theatrical sigh that was so entirely her, so entirely Sarah's, actually, a gesture that could have stepped straight out of Miriam's memory of her younger sister at the same age, that Miriam's chest pulled tight for a half second before she swallowed it back down. She was good at swallowing things down. That was another skill Red Hollow had perfected in her. Red Hollow sat at the edge of where the Kansas plains started pretending they might eventually become something else. To the west, the land went on flat and uninterrupted until the sky finally put a stop to it. To the east, some low-rolling hills broke up the horizon just enough to give the impression of variety without delivering on it. There was a church, a school, a general store, a telegraph office, 2 saloons, one respectable, one less so, a small hotel, a doctor who was sometimes sober, and approximately 400 people who had all, in one way or another, decided that Red Hollow was where they were going to make their stand. It was a town built by people who'd had hard years. Most of them carried the marks of it in their hands and their eyes. And the particular way they moved, slightly braced, like they were waiting for the next thing to go wrong. That kind of history made them generous in some ways and merciless in others. And the merciless parts tended to surface most consistently around anyone who seemed, by the narrow standards of the frontier, to be doing something that wasn't done. Miriam Holloway had been doing something that wasn't done for 4 years. She'd arrived in Red Hollow in the spring of 1882 with a 2-year-old on her hip, a trunk of sewing tools, $43, and no husband in sight. She told no one the full story. She hadn't offered an explanation, hadn't volunteered an apology, hadn't made any of the small apologetic gestures that might have softened the town's first impression of her. She'd simply found the empty shop on Main Street, paid the first month's rent to Mr. Dutton at the land office, and started working. Within a week, The speculation had found its shape and settled in like furniture. No husband, no family, nobody to vouch for her. Girl can't be more than 2. That was the version Red Hollow had settled on. And 4 years later, it was still the version it believed, because Miriam had never offered another one. Not once. Not to anyone. There were reasons for that, reasons that lived in a locked part of herself she didn't open during business hours or at church. She sat in the back pew. It seemed like the respectful thing, or when she was helping Rose with her sums at the kitchen table in the evenings. She opened it sometimes at night, when the shop was locked and Rose was asleep, and the town had gone quiet enough that you could hear the wind moving through the grass at the edge of Main Street, that particular low, restless sound that had always made her feel both very small and strangely steadied at the same time. She'd open it then. Let herself think about Sarah. Sarah, who had been 23 years old and reckless with the same bright, forward-tilting energy that now lived in Rose's eyes. Sarah, who had fallen in love with a man who was already married and hadn't told her so, and who had come to Miriam's door in the summer of 1879 with a growing belly and a story that broke both their hearts in different places. "I can't keep it, Miriam." Sarah's voice, the last night they'd spent together before everything went wrong. "Not the way things are. They'll know what I did. Mama and Daddy are already, you know how they are. And the town we grew up in is smaller than this one, if you can believe it. If they find out, this child will never be anything but..." She'd stopped there, hadn't finished. But Miriam had finished it for her, silently, because she could. "This child will never be anything but the proof of her mother's mistake." "I'll take her," Miriam had said. "Not let me think about it. Not are you sure. Just, I'll take her." Sarah had cried. The ugly kind. The kind that came from the bottom of things. She'd held Miriam's face in both hands and said, "Don't let her know shame. Don't let her grow up bowing her head at anyone." And Miriam had promised, because Sarah was her sister and had been her closest friend since childhood, and that kind of love doesn't have very many conditions on it. Or any, if you're being honest. 2 weeks later, Sarah had died in labor. The baby girl had survived, small, furious, perfect. And Miriam had named her Rose because Sarah had always said that roses were the most honest flowers. They advertised their thorns. They didn't pretend. So Miriam had done the only thing she could think of that would protect the child from the specific cruelty of being known as the result of a scandal. She had put on the scandal herself, the way you put on a coat in bad weather. Not because you want to, but because someone has to keep warm, and the smaller one can't carry the weight of it. She hadn't expected it to feel like wearing the coat forever. The other women of Red Hollow had sorted themselves into 3 camps over 4 years, the way women in small towns tend to do with the people they've decided to have opinions about. There were the ones who refused to enter her shop at all, which was fine by Miriam because those women generally had more principle than money, and she couldn't afford too many customers who paid in righteousness. There were the ones who came in, bought dresses, and treated the entire transaction with the particular careful courtesy of people doing business with someone they privately disapprove of. The kind of courtesy that's more insulting than rudeness, because at least rudeness is honest. And then there was a third group, smaller than the others, who had come to something that might have been, without anyone officially admitting it, a grudging kind of respect. Not warmth, not friendship, but the acknowledgement, offered in compressed and limited doses, that Miriam Holloway worked hard, raised that child decently enough considering, kept her shop clean, kept her prices fair, and never once, not once in 4 years, had caused a single piece of visible trouble for anyone in Red Hollow. That group was led, more or less by default, by Nora Jacobs, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Clarence and had a laugh like a dog barking and was approximately the most direct person Miriam had ever met in her life. Nora had walked into Miriam's shop 3 months after it opened, looked around, said, "Nice seams," and ordered a work dress without any of the apologetic distance the others carried. She'd been doing it roughly once a season ever since, and she'd never once asked about the father, which, in Red Hollow, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You look tired," Nora said on a Thursday afternoon in early October, depositing a bolt of blue calico on the counter that Miriam hadn't ordered and raising her hand before Miriam could speak. "Before you tell me you're fine, I'll say that you always say that, and I always don't believe you, so we might as well skip that part." Miriam set down her scissors. "I appreciate the efficiency. Where's the kid?" School. Nora leaned on the counter with both elbows. The Prescott boy threw mud at her again. Ida Prescott came in this morning and told me like she expected me to be pleased about it. I told her that if I ever heard of her son doing that again, I would personally discuss it with Gerald Prescott in front of the whole Saturday market crowd, and she'd better believe I meant it. Miriam was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't have to. Nora shrugged, not dismissively, but with the casual ease of someone who has long since decided how much she is willing to do and is at peace with it. Rose is a child. Her business with the Prescott boy stops now. She pushed the calico across the counter. That's for a dress for my niece's birthday, October 23rd. Something practical but not boring. I can do that. Miriam touched the fabric. It was good quality, the kind Nora stocked because she refused, on principle, to sell things that wouldn't last. Thank you, Nora, for what you said to Ida Prescott. Nora straightened up and pulled her coat. Don't thank me. I like the kid. She's got a mouth on her. She headed for the door, then paused with her hand on it. They all did that, Miriam noticed. They all had things to say on their way out, and looked back. Garrett Boone's been back in town, just so you know. Miriam's hands went still on the fabric. Came in for supply orders this morning, Nora said, as if commenting on the weather. Bought enough for a winter and then some, so he's planning to stay through to spring. A pause. He asked about you. The bell above the door chimed, and Nora was gone before Miriam could think of a single thing to say to that. She'd met Garrett Boone on an afternoon in the previous September. She'd been loading bolts of fabric into the wagon bed outside the mercantile. The heavy ones, the wools and the canvas, the kind that required real physical effort, and had dropped 2 of them off the tailgate at the same moment, one landing in the dust of the street and one catching the corner of the crate she'd put down to help leverage the load. And she'd said something under her breath that she would not have said if Rose had been within earshot. A pair of hands had appeared from her left and picked up the bolt in the street before she'd even registered the person attached to them. Which one goes up first? She turned to find a man she didn't recognize, which was unusual in Red Hollow after 4 years of learning everyone. He was tall without being lean about it, built the way outdoor men who actually work get built. Not fashioned, just shaped by use. With a weathered face that might have been 35 or 45, it was hard to say, and dark eyes that were asking a practical question and appeared to be waiting, with no particular impatience, for a practical answer. The smaller one, she said after a half-second. Then the blue canvas on top. He lifted them in the right order, correctly braced, without making a production of it. She appreciated that. Men who made a production of helping always seemed to want something specific in return for it. Thank you, she said when they were settled. Sure. He dusted his hands on his pants. You're the seamstress, the shop between the post office and the old millinery. That's right. I've been meaning to come in. I've got some work shirts that need the collar repaired on 2 of them and a new button seam on a 3rd. Nothing urgent. I can do that. Any day except Sunday. He nodded. She'd expected him to tip his hat and move on, which was what most men did when they'd finished having a practical conversation with a woman they'd just met. Instead, he stood there for another moment, not in a presumptuous way, more like a man who is still thinking about something. You need the rest of those loaded? I have 2 more. She'd said it before she'd made a decision about saying it. He loaded the other 2 bolts without being asked twice. She drove the wagon back to the shop and had almost talked herself into the idea that it had been an unremarkable interaction by the time she turned the corner and realized she'd never asked his name. His name was Garrett Boone, which she learned from Nora Jacobs the next morning when she mentioned, as briefly as possible, that she'd had help loading the wagon. Nora had told her more than she'd asked for, because that was Nora's particular gift. Garrett Boone, 37 years old, had worked a ranch 20 miles southwest of town for 11 years, building it from a quarter section his father had left him into something considerably larger and more viable. Good reputation in the county for straight dealing. Paid his debts, kept his contracts, didn't pick fights, won the ones he couldn't avoid. Had been briefly, unhappily, married about 6 years ago to a woman from Wichita who had found, after 18 months of Red Hollow winters, that she did not wish to continue finding it. The divorce had been quiet and legally neat. He had not since then been linked in any consistent way to anyone else, which in Red Hollow was considered either admirable self-discipline or something a touch unusual, depending on who you asked. He has a good name in this town, Nora had added, with a slight emphasis that Miriam had chosen not to engage with. People respect him, which is something in a place like this when you think about who gets respected and who doesn't. Miriam had said she needed to get back to her cutting. Nora had gone back to organizing bolts of wool with the satisfied expression of someone who has said exactly as much as they intended to say. He came into the shop 3 days later with 2 shirts and a third folded under his arm, and he laid them on the counter and explained the repairs with the same practical clarity he'd shown in the street. No flourishes, no filling the air with unnecessary words, just the thing that needed saying, said plainly. Miriam examined the collar damage, the button seam, standard work, a day's repair, maybe less. 3 days, she said, quarter each for the collars, 30 cents for the button seam. Fair enough. He paused in the way she'd noticed him pausing before, like he was finishing a thought before he left it. Is that the child? Playing out back? Miriam had forgotten the window. It faced the narrow alley behind the shop, and Rose had been out there since noon with a piece of chalk in the back wall of the building, conducting what appeared to be an ambitious artistic project. Yes, Miriam said carefully. He looked for another moment. How old? 6. What's her name? A small beat. Rose? He nodded, like that was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question, and turned for the door. I'll be back Thursday. He was back Thursday. The shirts were ready. He paid exactly what she'd asked, examined the work with the careful attention of someone who knows what he's looking at, said, "Good work," and left. She told herself that was the end of it. She told herself this with the confident authority of a woman who has been wrong about things before. October came in cold and clear, the way the best Kansas Octobers do, when the air has a particular sharpness that makes everything look more defined, like the world has been cleaned up and the edges redrawn. Garrett Boone came back to the shop the following Friday with a jacket that needed the lining replaced and a pair of pants with a split seam. This time, Rose was sitting in her usual corner, not in the back, and she looked up from her book when he came in with the open, evaluating gaze she gave everyone new. Miriam watched her watch him. "You're the man who helped with the fabric," Rose said. Garrett Boone stopped midway through setting his jacket on the counter. He looked down at the child. "I am." "Mama didn't ask your name?" "Rose." A warning. "She didn't, though. I asked her, and she said she didn't know it." Garrett glanced at Miriam with what might have been, in another man, amusement, though his face was composed enough that she couldn't be entirely certain. "Garrett Boone," he said to Rose, "and you're Rose." Rose considered this. "How did you know?" "Your mother told me." "When?" "When you were out back with the chalk." He set the jacket down properly now and looked at it instead of her. "You're drawing on the whole wall out there." Rose straightened on her stool. "I'm making a map." "Of what?" She hesitated in the calculating way children hesitate when they're deciding whether an adult is worth the full explanation. "Of the places I'm going to go someday," she said finally. The shop was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved along the street with that particular October sound, low and directional, like it had somewhere to be. "How many places?" Garrett asked. 7 so far?" Rose paused. "I might add more." "Probably should." He turned back to the counter. "I've got a jacket lining and a seam. When can you have them?" "Wednesday," Miriam said. He nodded, thanked her, and left. Rose watched the door for a moment after the bell stopped chiming. "I like his voice," she said. "Read your book." "I'm just saying, Rose." A sigh. Pages opening. Miriam turned back to her work and spent the next 10 minutes being very deliberate about the seam she was pressing, and not thinking about anything else at all. Malta. He came back Wednesday, and on the following Tuesday for a winter vest, and twice more in October for things that were less urgently needed than the previous visits, a fact she did not think about overmuch. The 4th time, he arrived at closing when the light through the front window had gone from afternoon gold to the flat, directionless gray of early evening, and Rose had already been taken upstairs to the 2 rooms above the shop that constituted their home, and put to bed with her book and a candle. Miriam was locking the display case when the bell rang. "I know it's late," Garrett said from the doorway. "I can come back." "I haven't locked the door yet." She stood up. "What do you need?" He came in slowly, hat in hand, which she noticed because he hadn't bothered with that particular formality before, and she filed it in the part of her mind that tracked small things. "Nothing, actually," he said. "I mean, I was going to bring a pair of gloves for lining, but they're not urgent." She looked at him. He looked back at her, which was something she noticed that Garrett Boone did consistently. He looked at you instead of past you, instead of toward the shop floor or the window or the middle distance, the way people looked when they were having a conversation they were slightly ashamed of having. "Miss Holloway," he said, "can I ask you something?" Every part of her stilled. "That depends on what it is." He was quiet for a half second, a man considering his words, which she respected more than she wanted to. "I've been in this town 11 years, he said. "I know everyone. I know how it works, and I've noticed what people say when your name comes up." He stopped. "I'd like to know if you're willing to say whether any of it is true." The shop felt very still. Miriam set down the key she was holding. "That's a direct question," she said. "I know it is. I figure you're owed that at least." She thought about the ways she could answer, the deflections, the polite reshapings. She'd used all of them in various combinations for 4 years. She was very good at them. "No," she said, "not the way they mean it." He held her gaze. "All right." That was all he said. All right. Not what she'd expected, which had been, she realized she'd been braced for the follow-up, the next question, the push. He didn't push. He just received what she'd said and stood with it, and the absence of the push disarmed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Is there more?" he asked after a moment. "You don't have to tell me." She picked up the key again, turned it over in her fingers. "There's more," she said. "But it's not a shop-closing story." The corner of his mouth moved. "I didn't think it was." He put his hat back on. "I'll bring the gloves by Friday." He went out into the October evening. Miriam locked the door and stood in the quiet shop for a long minute, listening to the wind outside going wherever October wind goes, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that wasn't quite unsettled but was in the same neighborhood. The particular feeling of a door that might have been, just slightly, opened. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. By the second week of November, Red Hollow had noticed Garrett Boone. This was not unusual. Red Hollow noticed everything, but the specific shape of its noticing had a particular flavor that Miriam felt each time she walked to the mercantile or stopped at the post office or brought Rose to the schoolyard. It wasn't the old flavor, the one she'd tasted for 4 years, the low-grade ambient disapproval that had become as constant and unremarkable to her as the dust on the windowsill. This was something sharper, more purposeful, with a slight edge of glee in it. People were watching to see what would happen. Garrett had started walking past her shop in the mornings. He had legitimate business on Main Street, the feed store, the land office, the telegraph, and she told herself that the route he took was simply the most direct one, which may have been true. He stopped in twice in 2 weeks, once with the gloves, once with a winter coat that needed the buttons reinforced. He didn't stay long. He didn't say anything that couldn't have been said in front of the whole town without raising a single eyebrow. But he spoke to Rose. That was the thing. He spoke to Rose the way adults rarely spoke to children in Red Hollow. Not performing for the parents' benefit the way they did sometimes when they wanted to seem fond, but with actual attention. He asked about the map on the wall. He'd apparently walked around the back of the building at some point and looked at it. "You've got the Western Territories wrong," he said to Rose on his second November visit, while Miriam was at the counter working the buttonholes on his coat. "The space between there and there," he pointed at the marks Rose was showing him on a small paper version she'd copied inside. "That's not how far it is." Rose frowned at her paper. "How do you know?" "I've been there." She looked up. "To the Western Territories?" "Spent 2 years out there before I came back to Kansas." "Why did you come back?" "The land's better here." He said it simply, without nostalgia or performance. "Better for what I wanted to build." "What did you want to build?" "Something that lasts." He glanced over at Miriam just briefly. Most things worth building take longer than you think. Rose looked at him for a moment with those quick, serious eyes. Do you have children? Miriam went still at the counter. No, Garrett said. Why not? Rose. Miriam's voice was quiet but final. The girl pressed her lips together. Garrett looked over at Miriam with an expression she couldn't quite read, not irritated, not performing patience, and then looked back at the child. That's a fair question, he said to Rose. The simple answer is that it didn't happen the way I'd have wanted it to. Rose considered this. That's sad? Some things are, he said. They're still worth wanting. He paid for the coat, said goodbye to both of them with equal directness, and went out into the cold November street. Miriam looked at the door after it closed. Then she looked at Rose, who was looking at the door too. He's not like the others, Rose said. Don't get attached. Rose turned to her with an expression that was, for a 6-year-old, disturbingly perceptive. Why? Because people's lives are complicated, Miriam said, and it's not always simple the way things work out. Rose looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up her paper map and went back to correcting the Western Territories, and Miriam went back to her work. And neither of them said anything else about it for the rest of the day. But she thought about it that night, lying in the narrow bed in the room above the shop, with the wind working the eaves and Rose's soft breathing audible through the thin wall between them. Miriam thought about the specific and inconvenient fact that Garrett Boone had at some point, quietly and without apparent effort, become a person she found herself thinking about between his visits. That was a problem. She had become, over 4 years, very practical about problems. She identified them, named them, and set them in a place where they couldn't do much damage while she kept working. It was a system that had served her in situations that would have broken a less organized person. The trouble with Garrett Boone as a problem was that he didn't hold still where she put him. Okay. The town's official opinion formed and announced itself at the November market. Miriam heard it from Nora, who delivered information the way she delivered everything else. Straight, undiluted, with the implication that you were expected to handle it. Gerald Prescott had a conversation with Garrett at the feed store yesterday, Nora said, measuring out a length of ribbon that Miriam needed for a commission. Loud enough that Willis Dutton heard it from the land office door. Miriam kept her face still. What kind of conversation? The kind where Gerald Prescott says he's only asking as a friend. Nora's scissors came down on the ribbon with a decisiveness that suggested how she felt about Gerald Prescott's version of friendship. He told Garrett that people were noticing he'd been spending time in your shop, that for a man of his standing in the county, that was, Gerald's word now, unwise. A pause. What did Garrett say? Nora folded the ribbon and set it on the counter with deliberate neatness. He said he was buying coat repairs and thought the work was good, and that he didn't see what Gerald's standing in the county had to do with the quality of Miss Holloway's stitching. Miriam absorbed this. Gerald pushed further, Nora said there were things a man should know before he went spending time with a woman in her situation. That there were questions about the child, the kind of questions that decent women in this town had. And? The word came out flatter than Miriam intended. And Garrett said, Nora paused, and her voice shifted slightly. Something in it that wasn't quite amusement, but was something. He said that if anyone in Red Hollow had bothered to ask Miss Holloway a direct question, instead of spending 4 years constructing an answer for her, they might have found something worth hearing. The shop was very quiet. He said that? Miriam asked. Willis Dutton told me word for word. Nora picked up her gloves from the counter. I thought you ought to know. She headed for the door, then turned back. They always turn back, with the expression of a woman who has one more thing to say. He also told Gerald that he'd been handling his own affairs since he was 17 years old and didn't expect to stop now. She went out. Miriam stood at the counter for a moment. Then she went to the back room where Rose was working on her map again and sat down across from her and said, How would you feel about getting some fresh air this afternoon? Rose looked up immediately. Yes. Don't make it sound like a jailbreak. Sorry. The girl was already putting down her pencil. Yes, please. They walked out into the November afternoon together, Miriam and Rose, through the front door of the shop and down the main street of Red Hollow, and Miriam kept her head up, the way she always did, because 4 years of practice had made it automatic. She thought about a man who had told Gerald Prescott in the feed store, loud enough for Willis Dutton to hear from the doorway, that the questions ought to have been asked directly. She thought about what it might mean, in a town like this, for a man like him to have said that. And she thought, walking through the cold November light with Rose's hand in hers, that it was entirely possible she had not calculated this situation correctly. She thought about Sarah more in November than she had in a long time. This happened sometimes in the colder months, when the days shortened and the light took on that particular quality of late autumn, low and sideways and golden, that for reasons she couldn't entirely explain always carried Sarah with it. Maybe it was that Sarah had died in November. Maybe it was just the way grief worked. It didn't announce itself. It just arrived with the light change, the way certain smells brought certain rooms back. She thought about the last week, the hospital room in Hayes, which had smelled of carbolic and wood smoke, and the particular quality of quiet that sick rooms had. Not peaceful, but waiting. Sarah's hands on the coverlet, which had been thinner than Miriam expected, which had frightened her more than anything else, because Sarah had always had strong hands, their mother's hands, hands built for doing things. "Promise me she won't know," Sarah had said. Not the first time. She'd said it 3 times in the last 2 days, with the repetitive insistence of fever, the need to hear the answer again. "Promise she won't grow up knowing what I did." "She won't know," Miriam had said each time. "I promise. They'll say things. People will say things about you. I know. You don't have to." "Sarah." Miriam had covered her sister's hands with both of hers. "I know what I'm doing. Let me do it." She hadn't, in that moment, fully known what she was doing. She'd known the shape of it, the broad strokes. Take the child, raise her, give her a name that wasn't marked. She hadn't known the full weight of the coat she was putting on. You never know that until you've been wearing it a while. 4 years of Red Hollow had given her a thorough education in the weight of it, the thing she hadn't expected, the thing that surprised her still sometimes, when she looked up from her work and saw Rose at her corner stool, serious and bright-eyed and entirely herself, was how the weight could be both the heaviest and the lightest thing in her life at the same time. It was heavy the way good work was heavy, the way the satisfaction of something done right had a mass to it that felt like more than the thing itself. She was tired. That was true. And she was honest with herself about it in the dark, when honesty was cheaper. But she had kept the promise. And some nights that was enough, and some nights it had to be. And the difference between those two categories was something she'd learned to stop examining too closely. 10. November moved toward December, and Garrett Boone kept coming to the shop. He was careful about it. That was the word she kept coming back to, careful, in the sense of caretaken, deliberate, not in the sense of timid. He came for things that needed doing, not for pretexts, and he didn't overstay his time, and he talked to Miriam the way he talked to Rose, which was to say directly, without the elaborate indirection that most people used with her. He did not ask her about herself again after that October evening. He didn't press. He seemed to understand, without being told, that the door she'd opened a crack was still hers to open further, and that waiting was not a loss. That was, she thought, a sophisticated quality for a man who presented himself as entirely uncomplicated. She started to notice the ways he wasn't uncomplicated. He noticed when Rose seemed quieter than usual, which happened after the days at school when the Prescott boy made his opinions known, and he would ask her a question, always a real question, about the map, about her book, about something specific, that seemed designed to pull her out of wherever she'd gone. He did it without making a performance of doing it. He did it the way a person does something they've thought about. She noticed the way he looked at the shop. Not at her, but at the shop itself, with the assessing, appreciative attention of someone who understands what it took to build something. He'd said once, looking at the framed sketch of a dress pattern she'd hung beside the window, "That's a good design. Did you draft that yourself?" And when she said yes, he'd looked at it for another moment and said, "Thought so." And the matter-of-factness of it had been more satisfying than a dozen elaborate compliments would have been. She noticed, on a Wednesday in late November when he came in with 2 more shirts and a pair of canvas work pants, that the buttons on his coat were the ones she'd reinforced 3 weeks ago, and they were holding exactly as they should, and the small, quiet pride she felt about that was entirely disproportionate to its importance as a piece of information. She noticed that she was noticing. It was a Tuesday in December, the second week, when he said what she had been, without fully admitting it to herself, been waiting for him to say. Rose was in the back. It was mid-morning, light and cold, and the street outside was busy with the particular hustle of a town preparing for winter in earnest. He'd come in with nothing to repair, which she noticed the moment he walked through the door because his hands were empty. "I don't have any work for you," he said, confirming it. "I noticed." He stood at the counter for a moment, that considering pause he had before he committed to saying something. Then he said, "I'd like to take you and Rose to the Saturday market this weekend, if you're willing." Miriam held the fabric she was working with in both hands and said nothing for a moment. Garrett, his name, for the first time. She hadn't meant to use it. "You know what that means if you're seen with us at the market." "I know what it means." "Gerald Prescott will—" "I'm not especially worried about Gerald Prescott's opinion." She looked at him steadily. "You should be. He talks to the people who matter to your contracts, your supply lines. Men like Gerald Prescott have more influence over your ranch than you'd like to think." "Maybe." He didn't look away. "But I find that I'm more interested in what I think is right than in what Gerald Prescott thinks is safe." "That's an easy thing to believe when you haven't paid the cost yet." The words came out harder than she'd meant them to. He absorbed them without flinching. "That's fair," he said. "But I'd like to start paying attention to whether the cost is real before I let it stop me from doing something." The shop was very quiet. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a basket of winter squash and didn't look in. "Why?" Miriam asked. The real question, the one under the practical ones. "Why does it matter to you? You don't know anything about me." He was quiet for a moment. When he answered like a man choosing honesty over a more comfortable answer. "I know you've been raising that child for 4 years with more dignity than the people judging you have managed in their whole lives," he said. "I know you work hard and do it well, and you've never asked anyone for anything. I know your daughter maps places she's never been because you've told her the world is larger than this town." He paused. "That's not nothing to know about a person." Miriam looked down at the fabric in her hands. "It's not daughter," she said. The words surprised her. She hadn't planned them. They came out the way things come out when the walls have been up long enough that they start, sometimes, in unexpected moments, to come down a little on their own. She looked up. He was watching her. "She's—" Miriam stopped. The familiar weight of the coat settled around her shoulders. "It's complicated." "Most things worth understanding are," Garrett said. She set the fabric down. "Saturday market," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not relief, not triumph, more like a door that had opened from the other side. "Yes," he said. "I haven't said yes." "I know." The corner of his mouth. "You've said Saturday market. That's further than before." She thought, not for the first time, that he was considerably less uncomplicated than he chose to appear. "Let me think about it," she said. "I'll come back Friday." "I know you will." He went out into the December morning. Rose appeared in the back doorway with her book, watching the closed door with her mother's eyes. "Was that Mr. Boone?" "Yes." "What did he want?" Miriam picked up the fabric again. "To make things more complicated," she said. Rose considered this with the gravity of someone 6 years old with a sophisticated map of the world on the back wall of the building. "Sometimes complicated is better than simple," she said. Miriam looked at her niece, her sister's child, the promise made in a hospital room in haze with carbolic and wood smoke and thin hands on a coverlet. "Sometimes," she said. She went back to her work. The morning light came through the window, low and winter flat, and turned the dust in the air gold. And outside on the street of Red Hollow, the world went about its business, indifferent and unaware of the particular weight of what was shifting, quietly, in the narrow shop between the post office and the shuttered millinery. Rose went back to her map. Miriam pressed her seam, and the clock on the wall ticked toward Friday. Friday came the way Garrett said it would, which was without ceremony and exactly on time. He walked through the door of the shop at mid-morning, when the light was still climbing and the street outside had the particular busy but not rushed quality of a Friday in December, people settling accounts and loading wagons before the weekend closed things down. He had his hat in his hand again, which Miriam had begun to read, not as a performance of politeness, but as a signal of intention, The way men who spend most of their time outdoors carry their bodies differently when they mean something by being inside. "Well," he said. "Good morning to you too," Miriam said without looking up from the dress she was hemming. "Good morning." A pause. "Well?" She set the dress down on the counter, looked at him directly. "I've thought about it." "I know, you said you would. The market is not a small thing in this town. It's the whole town, all at once, on one street. I know what the market is. If you're seen walking through it with me and Rose, Miriam." He said her name the way you'd say something you'd been holding for a moment. "I know what I'm asking. I'm asking it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back the way he always did, steadily, without the slight backward lean men sometimes had when they were trying to give themselves room to retreat from something. "Rose wants to go," she said finally. "I figured she might. She wants to look at the livestock pens. Apparently she's adding farms to her map and needs to understand scale." The corner of his mouth. "That's a good reason." "It's her reason. Mine is different." She picked up the dress again. "My reason is that I've spent 4 years making decisions based on what this town thinks of me. I'm tired of it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a better reason," he said. Saturday morning arrived cold and iron gray, the kind of December sky that couldn't decide between clouds and clarity and settled on a colorless compromise that gave everything equal, unflattering light. Miriam dressed Rose in her wool coat and braided her hair and told her twice not to run ahead. And Rose agreed both times with the sincere, temporary compliance of a child who intends to comply until something more interesting presents itself. Garrett was waiting at the corner of Main and 2nd, which was not in front of the shop, which Miriam appreciated. It was a small thing, not staging it at her door, not making the opening image of it maximally visible. He had clearly thought about that. He was wearing a clean coat and a hat that wasn't his working one. And when Rose saw him, she walked faster in the specific way children walk faster when they're trying not to run. "Mr. Boone." She arrived beside him with great dignity. "Are we going to the livestock pens first?" "We can," he said, "if your mother agrees on the order of things." Rose looked at Miriam. "Livestock pens," Miriam said. "Then the market." The Saturday market in Red Hollow ran the length of 2 blocks, spilling off the main street into the side lot beside the church, and it smelled of horses and wood smoke and fry bread and the particular sharp sweetness of late-season apples that someone always brought down from the north. It was loud with the layered noise of 100 conversations and children being corrected and animals registering their opinions about the situation, and in any other context, Miriam might have found it pleasant. In this context, she felt it the moment they turned onto the street. The attention moved across the crowd the way a wind moves across tall grass. You see the effect before you can identify the cause. People's conversations paused. Eyes moved. A woman near the jam stand touched her companion's arm, and the companion looked up and then looked away with the specific deliberateness of someone choosing not to be seen looking. Rose felt none of it. She had located the livestock pens and was already moving toward them with the focused purpose of a 6-year-old who has a cartographic mission. Garrett walked beside Miriam, unhurried, at the pace of someone who has no particular concern about the grass bending around him. "Gerald Prescott is at the apple stand," Miriam said quietly. "I see him. He's watching. Most people here are watching." He said it without heat, without tension, as a statement of fact. "That's all right. Watching costs them something, too." She glanced at him. "Does it?" "Having an opinion about other people's business takes energy. I've always found it comes back around." They stopped at the livestock pen, where Rose had already attached herself to the fence rail and was studying a pair of draft horses with the serious attention she brought to everything she deemed worth understanding. Garrett leaned on the fence beside her and pointed out something about the way the near horse was standing, something about the hooves, some practical ranching knowledge that Rose immediately incorporated by pulling out the small folded paper she kept in her coat pocket, which was her portable map, and making a mark on it. Miriam stood slightly back and watched this. Watched her. Sarah's child. Her child, the child she'd carried in her heart for 4 years with the particular weight of love that has no official name. Watched Rose turn to Garrett and ask him something, and watched him answer seriously, without the patronizing simplification adults usually brought to children's questions. She thought, this is the part where it gets harder. Not the market, not the watching, Not Gerald Prescott at the apple stand, making no effort to disguise his attention. The harder part was this, the quiet, ordinary moment at the fence rail, because it had a shape she recognized, the shape of something she wanted. And wanting specific things, for Miriam Holloway, had always been the more dangerous business. Gerald Prescott made his move at the jam stand. She'd known he would. It was just a matter of when, and the when turned out to be 20 minutes into the market, when Rose had moved on to examine a pen of sheep, and Miriam was looking at a bolt of winter wool from a woman who sold out of a wagon near the end of the first block. Garrett had stepped away briefly to speak to the man from the feed store about a delayed delivery, which meant he was 10 feet away and within earshot, but not immediately beside her. Gerald Prescott was 63, thick through the chest, and had the particular confidence of a man who has been the loudest person in most rooms he'd entered for 40 years. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, which made him important in ways that Red Hollow never let him forget, and that he never let Red Hollow forget he hadn't forgotten. He stopped beside Miriam with the air of a man making a social call. "Miss Holloway." He looked at the wool she was examining, not at her. "Getting in your winter supplies?" "I am." She kept her hands on the fabric. "Good quality." He reached past her and pinched a corner of it between two fingers. "Sutton's stuff is always reliable." He released it. "I see you've got company this morning." She didn't answer. "Garrett's a good man," Gerald said, in the tone of a man who is about to qualify that statement. "Known him since he started working that ranch. Solid, respectable." The pause that followed was long enough that the woman selling the wool had found somewhere else to look. "It'd be a shame to see that change." "I agree," Miriam said. "Integrity is worth protecting." Gerald looked at her directly for the first time. He had small gray eyes that were sharper than the rest of his face suggested. "You know what I'm saying?" "I think you're being careful about saying it directly," she said. "Which is interesting, for a man who speaks as plainly as you usually do." Something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but the adjustment of a man recalculating. "I'm only saying that a man in Garrett's position, with his reputation, his contracts, his standing in this county, he has things to lose. And sometimes people don't consider that. In their own interest." "In my own interest," Miriam said. "That's right. You're telling me that caring about my own interest means stepping back from Garrett Boone's company. I'm saying some people might see it that way." She set down the fabric, turned to face him fully, which Gerald Prescott visibly had not expected. "Mr. Prescott," she said, and her voice was even because she'd had 4 years of practice at even, "I understand what you're trying to do. I'd ask you to consider that you've been having this kind of conversation with and about me for 4 years, and I'm still here. My shop is still here. She paused on the word, not from hesitation, but from intention. My daughter is still here, and the only standing I've ever been interested in is my own." She picked the wool back up and turned to the woman behind the wagon. "I'll take 3 yards. Gerald Prescott stood there for another moment. Then he moved away, back toward the apple stand, with the gait of a man who has not exactly lost, but is reconsidering the terrain. Garrett was beside her by the time she'd finished paying. "I saw," he said. "I know you did. Did you need—" "No." She folded the wool over her arm. "I didn't need anything, but thank you." He looked at her with that particular look he had, the one she'd stopped being able to entirely read because it had too many things in it. Then he said, "Rose is interrogating the sheep farmer about wool grades." "Of course she is." He seems pleased about it. "She has that effect on people who aren't too invested in their opinions to enjoy a good question." They walked back toward Rose, side by side, through the middle of the Saturday market in Red Hollow, and Miriam kept her head up the way she'd learned to, and she didn't look at the people who were watching, and she felt, under the fatigue and the wariness and the practiced armor of 4 years, something she hadn't felt in a long time walking through this town. She felt like she was exactly where she'd chosen to be. That lasted until Monday morning, when the machinery of Red Hollow's social opinion got properly organized. It arrived first through Ida Prescott, Gerald's wife, who had always handled the social dimensions of her husband's business interests with considerably more finesse than Gerald himself. Ida was at 3 houses by Monday afternoon, which Miriam knew because Nora Jacobs told her Tuesday morning with the faithful reporting efficiency of someone who understood that information was a form of care. "She's telling people Garrett's being taken advantage of," Nora said. "That you engineered the market appearance. that men without family, without women to guide them, are susceptible to... Nora's mouth pressed flat. She said cunning. That was her word. Miriam was at her cutting table. She kept her scissors moving. What else? She raised the question of Rose again, who the father is. Said she'd heard a name, though she didn't say whose name, which means she's making it up. Nora paused. Margaret Holt won't be bringing her girls to your shop for their spring dresses. Margaret Holt doesn't pay on time anyway. That's true. Nora watched her. Miriam? I'm fine. You're cutting that fabric too fast. Miriam stopped, looked down. The cut wasn't bad, but Nora was right that it was faster than her standard, which was her body betraying what her face had decided not to show. She set the scissors down. I knew it would happen, she said. I knew the market would do this. So why'd you go? She thought about the fence rail, about Rose with her map paper and a question about draft horse hooves, about the feeling of walking through the middle of Main Street and choosing it. Because I was tired, she said, of not going. Nora was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Miriam looked up. He came to our store Monday morning, Nora said. Garrett. Bought supplies, like usual. Willis mentioned, casual, you know Willis, that there'd been some talk around the market after Saturday. She straightened a bolt of fabric that didn't need straightening. Garrett said he'd heard. Willis asked if he wanted to make a comment about it, just to clear the air, maybe save himself some trouble. She paused. Garrett said he'd had all the comment he needed on Saturday and didn't see the use of repeating himself. Miriam looked at the table. He's going to get hurt by this, she said. Not right away. But these things accumulate. Gerald Prescott has long memory and longer reach. Probably. I should tell him to stop. You could try. Nora picked up her basket. I'd bet against it, personally. He came to the shop Thursday. He had nothing to repair. He didn't pretend otherwise. I've heard what's being said, Miriam told him, before he'd gotten all the way through the door. She wanted it said first, not arrived at through the middle of something softer. Ida Prescott is working the social circuit. There's a version of this that doesn't just affect how people talk about me. It affects your contracts, your reputation with the county men you work with. I've heard what's being said, he agreed. He came to the counter. This town has a long memory, Garrett. I know. And you've spent 11 years building something here. Miriam. He waited until she stopped. I'm a grown man. I've been making decisions about what I'm willing to risk since before I came to this county. I don't need Gerald Prescott's approval for my choices, and I don't need you to protect me from the consequences of them. You don't know the full picture, she said, about me, about Rose. There are things... She stopped. I know there are. He was very still. And I'm not asking you to tell me before you're ready, but whatever they are, they don't change what I can see with my own eyes. What do you see? He looked at her for a moment. A woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and doing it alone, because she made a promise to someone. He paused. And a child who maps the world larger than the one she was given. The shop was completely quiet. Outside, December wind moved along the street. You can't know that, she said. The carrying part or the promise part? Either. Maybe not. He didn't back down from it. But I'm asking you to let me know you better, not the story Red Hollow has made up. You. She looked at him for a long moment. The winter light through the window was flat and honest, the kind that showed everything without flattering it. And in that light, Garrett Boone looked like what he was. A man who had worked hard for 11 years at something he'd built with his own hands, who was not young and not unaware of consequences, and who was standing in her shop on a Thursday afternoon because he had chosen to be. I need you to understand something, she said. If you push for this, whatever this is, and you find out what you don't yet know, and it changes things, it won't. You can't say that. You don't have the information. All right. He conceded it with a small nod. But I can say that I'm asking to have the information, and that I'm asking because I've decided I want to know, not because I stumbled into it. She turned away from him, walked to the window. The street outside was ordinary December. A wagon, 2 women talking outside the post office, a dog optimistic about its chances near the bakery doorway. My sister died in November, she said. 4 years ago. She heard him go very still. She was 23. She'd made... Miriam paused. This was the threshold. She could feel it. She'd made choices that she couldn't undo, and she came to me because there was no one else, and she asked me to... She stopped, turned back. This is not a shop conversation. No, he said quietly. It isn't. I'm not ready to... She pressed her lips together. There is a reason for everything that Red Hollow thinks it knows about me. And it's not the reason they think it is. And someday I will tell you the full thing. She looked at him. But not today. He nodded. He didn't press. He didn't fill the space with reassurances or questions. All right, he said, simple and complete. And she looked at him and felt the word for it was something she wouldn't have used out loud. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was there. She felt seen in the specific and uncomfortable way of a person who has been invisible by choice for a long time and is suddenly, without having fully authorized it, no longer invisible to at least one person. Garrett, she said his name. If this goes further, if you keep coming here and people keep watching, it is going to get worse before it's anything else. I know. I want you to mean that. Not the version where you mean it in the abstract, and then it gets specific and it turns out you didn't fully mean it. He met her eyes. I mean it specific, he said. She believed him. That was the thing she hadn't expected. That she would believe him, and that believing him would feel less like relief and more like standing at the edge of a long drop and deciding to trust the rope. Rose appeared in the back doorway. She looked at Garrett, then at Miriam, with those quick eyes that missed nothing. Are you staying for supper? She asked him. Rose, Miriam said. I'm asking because there's stew and I made too much. Garrett looked at Miriam. Miriam looked at her niece, who was watching her with the patient certainty of a 6-year-old who has already decided how this should go and is waiting for the adults to catch up. There's stew, Miriam said finally. If you want it. He stayed. The three of them ate at the small table in the back room, which had a low ceiling and a single lamp, and the smell of wood smoke and wool, and the stew that Rose had indeed made in large quantities for reasons she declined to explain. Rose talked about the livestock pens, and about the sheep farmer who had told her that wool grades depended on the breed and the season, information she was incorporating into the territorial sections of her map. Garrett told her that the ranches west of Red Hollow ran mostly cattle, but there were sheep operations further north, and that if she wanted, she could add them in. Have you been to all of these places? Rose asked, pointing at a section of the map she'd laid on the table beside her bowl. Some of them. Which ones? He pointed. She listened. She asked 3 more questions and wrote something in the margin of the map with the stub of pencil she kept in her pocket. Miriam ate her stew and watched the lamp throw their shadows against the low ceiling and did not say much because there was nothing she needed to say. And sometimes the right response to a moment is just to be in it. He left after supper, thanking Miriam for it plainly, the way you thank someone who has offered you something genuine. At the door, he paused. They always did, at the door, and looked back at Rose, who was already bent over her map again. She's going to need a bigger map, he said quietly. I know, Miriam said. He went out into the December night. Miriam locked the door and stood in the quiet shop for a moment, the way she often did. But what she felt standing there was different from the usual end-of-day accounting, the tallying up of what had been managed and what hadn't. What she felt was less tidy than that, less conclusive. December moved through its short days, and Garrett kept coming, and the town kept watching, and Miriam kept her head up and her shop open and her promise locked in the part of herself she hadn't yet shown him. But it was getting heavier, the keeping of it, not in the way it had been heavy before when she'd worn it alone and the weight had been simply the cost of a thing she'd decided to do. It was heavier now the way a secret gets heavier when there's a person nearby you want to tell it to, and you're holding it back, not because you've decided not to tell them, but because you haven't yet found the exact right moment for a thing that might change everything. January came. The town settled into the cold business of winter with its particular frontier grimness, and the Saturday markets were smaller, and the streets were quieter, and the gossip had less competition from other things, which meant it had more room to grow. Gerald Prescott had not finished with his opinions. Miriam heard this the way she heard most things about herself, secondhand, filtered through Nora, who delivered it without drama but without softening it either. Gerald had spoken to 3 of Garrett's contract partners. Not explicitly. not in a way that could be characterized as anything other than conversation. But the way he did it, the particular thing he said, the name he mentioned, the long pause he let sit after, was the work of a man who understood how reputation operates in a county economy. How you didn't need to say a thing directly to plant it where it would grow. Miriam knew this because one of those contract partners came into her shop the following week, ostensibly for a shirt repair, and the way he looked at her while doing it told her everything about what he'd been told. She told Garrett on a Tuesday. Straight out, no softening, the way you tell a person something hard when you respect them enough to say it clean. Gerald's working your contracts, she said, not loudly, carefully, the way he does things. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Which ones? He asked. She told him what Nora had told her. He listened with the still attention of a man calculating, not reacting, and the fact that his face didn't change much told her something about how well he'd learned to keep his own counsel. That's going to cost me, he said finally. Not a complaint. Just true. I know. It doesn't change anything, he said. She looked at him. Garrett, I need you to hear this and think about it for real, not dismiss it because you've already decided. This is money. This is your ranch, things you've spent 11 years building. She paused. I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking you to be certain. He looked back at her. I'm certain, he said, and I've heard you, and I understand what you're saying, and I'm still certain. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had loaded fabric bolts in a September street without being asked, who had asked Rose questions about her map like they mattered, who had stood in her shop on a December Thursday and said, I mean it specific, and meant it in a way she had believed. All right, she said, the word between them. His and hers both now, borrowed back and forth. Rose appeared with her coat on. She'd been in the back. Is it snowing? She asked. They both looked in the window. It was. Come on then, Miriam said, before it gets heavy. The three of them walked out into the first real snow of January, and Red Hollow lay white and quiet around them. And for a few minutes, the watching and the contracts and the weight of everything unsaid receded to the distance of background noise, and there was just the snow coming down in the flat winter light, and Rose holding her arms out to catch it, and Garrett standing beside Miriam on the street in front of her shop, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold. She didn't step away, and neither did he. The snow that had fallen in January stayed on the ground longer than anyone in Red Hollow had expected, packing itself into ice along the shaded edges of the street and making the whole town move a little more carefully, a little more deliberately, the way extreme cold forces a kind of honesty out of a place, stripping away the comfortable middle temperatures where people can pretend things are easier than they are. February came in hard. The wind off the plain had a particular cruelty to it that month, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your hat and stayed there. And the shop was cold in the mornings until Miriam got the small stove going, and Rose had taken to doing her reading wrapped in a wool blanket on the stool in the corner, looking like a very opinionated cocoon. Garrett came twice a week now. There was no pretense about repairs anymore. They'd moved past that without formally acknowledging it. The way two people move past a pretense when both of them know it was always a pretense and one day they simply stop using it. He came because he was courting her, and she was allowing it, and Red Hollow observed this with the focused attention of a town that had run out of more interesting things to watch in February. The opposition had organized itself, the way opposition always does when it feels its position slipping. It had moved from the ambient disapproval of individuals, Gerald's contract conversations, Ida's social circuit, into something more coordinated, something with the particular efficiency of people who have decided that a principle is at stake, and principles require action. The vehicle for this was the Women's Civic Society of Red Hollow, which met the second Thursday of each month in the back room of the church and concerned itself primarily with the moral character of the community, which was a category expansive enough to include almost anything they chose to include in it. Miriam was not a member. She had never been invited. She knew about the February meeting secondhand through Nora, who was a member and attended not because she agreed with most of what was said there, but because she believed that if people were going to make decisions that affected her neighbors, she was going to be in the room when they did it. They drafted a letter, Nora said, on the Friday after the meeting. She set it on Miriam's counter. Addressed to Garrett. I got a copy through Agnes Whitmore, who is in the society but is also, frankly, embarrassed by the whole thing and wanted someone outside the room to have a record of it. Miriam looked at the paper without picking it up. What does it say? The polite version is that they're concerned for the community's moral standing, and that Mr. Boone's public association with a woman of, they use the phrase uncertain character, is troubling to the decent families of Red Hollow. Nora's voice was even. The less polite reading is that it's a warning, delivered collectively so no single person has to own it. Are they sending it to him? Agnes thinks they already have. Someone delivered it to the ranch yesterday morning. Miriam stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up the letter and read it herself, which was different from hearing it summarized. The way seeing something written down makes it more real than being told about it. The language was careful, legal, almost. The kind of careful that took work to construct, that someone had revised 2 or 3 times to make sure it couldn't be called what it was without technically being something else. She set it back down. He'll have read it by now, she said. I'd think so. She was quiet. Outside, the February wind found the front of the shop and pushed against it. Nora, she said it without looking up. How bad is it, realistically, for him, if he continues? Nora was quiet for a moment too, which told Miriam that the answer wasn't the reassuring one. Realistically, Nora said, Gerald Prescott has 2 brothers in the county. One of them sits on the land assessment board. The other one has contracts with 3 of Garrett's buyers. She paused. They won't move immediately. They're not stupid enough to do it immediately, where it looks like what it is. But over a season, over a year, they can make things harder. Not impossible, but harder. She folded her hands on the counter. That's the realistic answer. Miriam nodded slowly. Garrett arrived at 2 in the afternoon, which was not his usual time, and the look on his face when he came through the door told her he'd gotten the letter before he opened his mouth. I read it, he said. I know, Nora told me. She was at the cutting table. She kept her hands on the fabric. Garrett, I need you to... Don't, he said, not harshly, but firmly. Don't tell me to reconsider, not because of that. It's not just that letter, it's Gerald's brothers, the land board, your buyers. I know what Gerald Prescott's brothers can do. He came to stand at the other side of the cutting table, which meant they were facing each other across it, across the fabric and the scissors and the ordinary materials of her working life. Miriam, I have known what was at stake since November. Every time you've told me to think about it, I've thought about it. I haven't changed my answer. Why not? She said it direct, the way he always said things to her. Honestly, because from the outside it doesn't make sense. You have a ranch you've spent 11 years building. You have a reputation in this county that took just as long, and you are risking both of those things for a woman this town has already decided isn't worth it. She held his gaze. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not finding the answer. She had the sense the answer was already there, but finding the right words for it. Because I've spent 11 years building things that matter, he said, and I've gotten good at knowing when I start something whether it's worth what it's going to cost. He paused. You're worth what it's going to cost. The shop was very quiet. You don't have enough information to say that, she said, but her voice had lost the argument in it. Then give me the rest of it, he said quietly. Whatever you're still holding, give it to me and let me decide with the full picture. She looked at him across the cutting table for a long moment. The weight she'd been carrying shifted, not lighter, not yet, but differently balanced, like something that has been held one way for so long you've forgotten it could be held another way. Rose, she called toward the back room. A pause, then small feet on the wooden floor, and Rose appeared in the doorway, with her blanket still around her shoulders and her book in her hand, looking between them with those quick, watchful eyes. Go upstairs, Miriam said. Take your book and the blanket. I'll come up in a little while. Rose looked at her for a moment with the specific perceptiveness she had always had, the quality of really looking at a person's face and reading what was there. Then she looked at Garrett, and something in his expression must have told her something, because she nodded with a seriousness that was unusual even for her, and went upstairs without saying anything, the sound of her feet on the stairs. Then quiet. Miriam set down the fabric she was holding and walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the February street. Then she turned back and said, Sit down if you want. He sat in the chair beside the display case, the one that was usually for customers waiting, and she stood near the window, and she told him about Sarah, all of it, this time. Not the threshold version she'd offered in December, not the outline. All of it. Sarah at 23, the married man who hadn't said he was married, the pregnancy and the shame and the calculation her sister had made, clear-eyed, not hysterical, just the arithmetic of a young woman doing the math on what her child's life would be in a town where everyone would always know the origin of it. The November hospital room and the carbolic smell and the thin hands and the promise made while Sarah's eyes were still fully present in her face. Still completely Sarah. Still the little sister who had once followed Miriam through their mother's cornfield and called her name over and over just to hear it echo back. She told him about arriving in Red Hollow, about the decision not to explain, not because she was ashamed, but because the truth, offered to a town like this one, would have followed Rose her whole life. The bastard daughter of a woman who'd made a fool of herself with a married man. Better for Rose to be the daughter of a woman the town disapproved of than to be herself, and carry that origin like a brand. She told him about the 4 years of wearing the coat, about the customers who bought her dresses and left without the wrapping paper, about Ida Prescott's son and the mud, about sitting in the back pew and the particular quality of being tolerated rather than welcomed. She told him about the nights when she'd thought about leaving, pulling up the shop and going somewhere else, and starting again where no one knew her, and then looked at Rose sleeping and thought about what it would do to a child to be uprooted again, and stayed. She told him about the weight of it. Not performing the weight. She wasn't a performer. It was one of the things she'd never been able to do well. Just describing it, honestly. The way the truth actually sits when you've been carrying it a long time. Heavy, and also, in some ways she couldn't entirely explain, a weight she was glad she'd chosen, because the promise was kept, and Sarah's daughter did not know shame. When she finished, the shop was very quiet. Garrett hadn't moved. He sat in the customer's chair with his forearms on his knees and his hat in his hands, looking at the floor, and she watched him the way you watch a person absorbing something real, waiting for the thing to settle. He looked up. His eyes were dark, and she thought considerably fuller than they'd been an hour ago. Not with sentiment exactly, but with the particular quality of a man who has been handed something heavy and felt the actual weight of it. Sarah, he said, the name like he was holding it carefully. Yes. She would have been... He stopped. She would have been proud of Rose. Miriam said it steadily. She would have been proud, and it would have broken her heart to miss all of it. I think about that sometimes. She paused. Often. He was quiet. Then he said, Does Rose know? No, she's 6. When will you... When she's old enough to hold it without it breaking something in her. She looked at her hands. I don't know exactly when that is, but I'll know. He nodded slowly. He set his hat on the arm of the chair and pressed his palms together, and she could see him working through something, not the acceptance of it. She thought he'd accepted it quickly, maybe immediately, but the full dimensions of it. The town, he said finally, if they knew, if the real story were told, it would change what they think of me, she said. Yes. You could have told them any time. In 4 years, you could have said, I know. She said it simply. But telling the story means making Rose the center of the story. And a town that knows the full origin of a child doesn't keep it to itself. It offers it to that child in small ways over years. At the schoolyard, in the way teachers say a name, in the things other children repeat from their parents. She looked at him. I wasn't willing to do that to her, even though it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything. She said it and meant it. It cost me the town's good opinion, which I never had much use for anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't say anything reassuring. He didn't fill the silence with comfort or with the easy language of someone trying to make the weight smaller than it was. He just said, quietly and without ornamentation, You're a remarkable woman, Miriam Holloway. She shook her head. I made a promise and kept it. That's all. That's not all, he said. That's not all by a long way. She looked away. The February light through the window was thin and pale, the color of something not quite finished. I need you to understand that this doesn't solve anything, she said. If anything, it makes the question of what to do next harder, not easier. Why harder? She looked back at him. Because now you know that the story this town has told about me isn't true. But you also know that the true story is more complicated than anything they've imagined. And complication doesn't make a situation simpler, Garrett. It usually does the opposite. He was quiet for a moment, considering that. Does it change what you want? He asked. Now that you've told me. The question surprised her. She stood with it for a moment. What do you mean? I mean, he turned his hat in his hands. Have you been keeping your distance from me, from this, because of the secret? And now that you've told it, does what you want change? She thought about the fence rail at the livestock pens and the snow falling in January and the supper table with the low lamp and the quality of being seen. She thought about all the ways she'd tried to keep this man at a manageable distance and how consistently she'd failed at it. No, she said. What I want hasn't changed. Then we're in the same place, he said, simply. She let out a slow breath. You make it sound straightforward. It's not. He stood. But I've found that most things that aren't straightforward still have a right direction, and I know which direction this is. He picked up his hat. He was almost at the door when she said, Garrett. He turned. Thank you, she said, for waiting, for the right kind of waiting. He nodded once, that particular nod of his that conveyed more than its brevity suggested. Then he went out into the February cold. Miriam stood in the quiet shop for a moment. Then she went upstairs to where Rose was reading under her blanket and sat on the edge of the bed, and Rose moved over without being asked to make room, and they sat together in the way they had always managed to be comfortable in small spaces, and Miriam said, Were you listening? Rose's eyes didn't leave her book. No. Rose. A small pause. Some of it. Miriam closed her eyes briefly. How much? The part about... Rose set her book down. Her face, when she looked up, was very serious in the way it got when she was carrying something that was heavier than usual. The part about your sister. The word sister in Rose's mouth applied to Sarah. Miriam felt the particular sharp pull of it in her chest. How much did you hear? She said again, more gently. Enough to understand, Rose said. Then, she was my real mama. It was not a question. Miriam looked at her niece, her daughter, both things at once, neither word fully sufficient, and found she had no language immediately available that was adequate to the moment. So she said the simplest true thing. Yes. Rose was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. And you pretended she wasn't, so people wouldn't be mean to me. Yes, another quiet. Then Rose said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften the sharpest questions, Were you sad? Doing that? Miriam thought about all the ways she could answer this. Then she said, Sometimes, but mostly I was busy. Rose looked up. Something in her face shifted. The child's version of the expression that Miriam had been wearing for 4 years. The one that said, I understand more than I'm showing. I like that she named me Rose, she said. Miriam's throat tightened. She said roses were honest. Because of the thorns. Because of the thorns. Rose picked up her book again. Then she set it back down. Is Mr. Boone going to stay? Or is he going to decide it's too complicated? I don't know, Miriam said. Then more honestly, I think he's going to stay. I think so too, Rose said, with the certainty of someone who has been studying the situation from her corner stool for months and has arrived at a conclusion she finds satisfactory. She picked her book back up. Can I read now? Yes. Miriam sat there a moment longer. Then she went back downstairs to close the shop for the evening. March arrived with the suggestion of thaw, the snow retreating from the centers of things toward the edges, and Red Hollow shook itself out after the long winter with the particular restlessness of a place that had been cooped up with its own opinions too long and was ready for something to happen. Something happened at the beginning of April. The annual harvest planning gathering, Red Hollow held it in the spring rather than the fall, which had always seemed backward to Miriam, but the logic was that the community decisions about who planted what and which roads needed repair before summer were better made in April than after the harvest, when everyone was tired and less interested in cooperation, was held on the first Saturday of the month in the town hall. It was the closest thing Red Hollow had to a mandatory community event, the kind that almost everyone attended because almost everyone had a stake in the decisions being made. Miriam had gone every year. She had stake in the road decisions, in the market calendar, in the school term schedule that affected when she could take in student dress commissions. She sat in the back and voted when voting was called for and did not volunteer for committees, and mostly she was treated as part of the furniture, which suited her. This year, Garrett had suggested he would sit with her. She had told him that was his choice to make, and he had made it. And so they'd arrived together. Garrett and Miriam and Rose, who was attending her first gathering because Miriam had decided, without announcing it, that Rose was old enough and that sitting at the back of the room watching democracy work was the kind of education her school didn't provide. The gathering had the usual shape for the first hour: road repair budgets, the summer market schedule, a disagreement about the school fence that got more animated than it deserved and had to be managed by Thomas Reardon, who ran the gatherings and had the particular patience of a man who has spent 20 years mediating disputes about fences. Miriam sat with her back straight in the second-to-last row, with Rose beside her and Garrett on her other side, and she felt the room's awareness of the arrangement but didn't look at it. She had gotten very good at not looking at it. It was during the break, when people stood and stretched and talked, that Dorothea Vance made her move. Dorothea Vance was 66 years old and had outlived 2 husbands and 3 business partners, and she occupied the particular position in Red Hollow's social structure of the woman who said what others were thinking in terms others found slightly too direct even while they agreed with her. She was the president of the Women's Civic Society. She had signed the letter. She crossed the room with the directness of someone who has decided on a course of action and is not interested in being deflected from it. And she stopped in front of Miriam with 15 people in reasonable earshot and the particular quality of attention that a room acquires when it senses something about to happen. "Miss Holloway," she said, loud enough. "There's been considerable conversation in this community about your situation. I think it's time to settle the matter plainly." The room's background noise reduced itself. People who had been reaching for the water jug or talking to their neighbors did the small adjustments people do when they're choosing to listen while pretending they're not. Miriam looked at Dorothea Vance and said nothing. "The question this community has been asking for 4 years," Dorothea said, "is simple, and I think you owe us a simple answer." She paused with the timing of a woman who had thought about this moment. "Who is the child's father?" The room went completely quiet. Not the gradual quiet of distraction fading, the immediate, total quiet of a collective intake of breath. Rose, beside Miriam, had gone very still. Miriam felt it without looking. The particular stillness of the child who had heard things on staircases and from corner stools, who was sitting very straight and looking at the floor and understanding in the way 6-year-olds understand things that aren't said simply but are felt completely, that something important was happening. Miriam opened her mouth. Garrett stood up, not slowly, not with the gathering reluctance of a man trying to decide. He stood up the way a man stands when he has been waiting for the moment and has been ready for it, and the movement was so immediate and complete that it pulled everyone's attention before anyone had processed what was happening. "I'll answer that," he said. The room looked at him. Dorothea Vance looked at him. Miriam looked at him. His voice was level. He wasn't performing calm. He was calm, with the particular quality of a man who has been angry and decided that anger was not the tool for the job and put it away somewhere it would keep. "The question you're asking," he said, "is about a child's origins, and I'll tell you what I know about that child's origins." He looked at Dorothea Vance directly. "I know she's being raised by one of the hardest working, most honest people in this town. I know she's being raised by someone who has kept her fed and educated and loved and decent without help from a single person in this room." He paused. "And I know that if Miriam Holloway does me the honor of accepting me, that child will be my daughter, and Miriam will be my wife." The silence in the room had a texture to it. Miriam felt it like a physical thing, the weight of it, the specific quality of a crowd that has been silenced not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening at once. Dorothea Vance's face had gone through 2 or 3 expressions in the space of 5 seconds. "Mr. Boone," she said, and her voice had lost some of its certainty, "that doesn't answer the question." "No," he said, "it doesn't, because it's not a question that belongs to this room." He looked around at the people who had been pretending not to listen. "The question of who Rose is belongs to Miriam and to Rose, not to the Women's Civic Society, not to Gerald Prescott, not to any person in this hall." He sat back down slowly, with the finality of a man who has said exactly what he came to say. Now, I believe Thomas was moving on to the summer road schedule. Thomas Reardon, to his considerable credit, immediately opened his folder and said, "Yes, the southern road from the mill junction, we had estimates come in from 2 contractors." And the meeting reorganized itself around him with the slightly dazed efficiency of people who needed something ordinary to do. Miriam sat very still. Rose, beside her, slipped her small hand into Miriam's and held it. Miriam looked down at her. Rose was looking straight ahead with her jaw set and her eyes bright, and that expression she had. Sarah's expression, she thought again, as she always did, the same thing in a different face. The one that said she had processed something and landed on the other side of it. "You okay?" Miriam said, low. Rose nodded, then quieter still. "He meant it, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. She said it the way a child says something when they're checking not the fact of it, but their own reading of it. "Yes," Miriam said. "He meant it." Rose squeezed her hand once and then let go and put both hands in her lap, and sat there with the straightened spine of someone who has received news that is large and is choosing to hold it properly. Miriam looked at the front of the room, where Thomas Reardon was explaining road repair estimates, and where half the room was looking at Thomas, and half was doing the thing people did when they were pretending to look at Thomas while actually recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Dorothea Vance, across the room, had sat down. She was looking at the floor. Miriam watched her for a moment and saw, for the first time in 4 years of Dorothea Vance's existence in her life, something she hadn't expected to see on that face. Not remorse, not yet, but the beginning of a question. The kind of question that precedes remorse, when a person starts to wonder if they had the story wrong. Garrett leaned slightly toward her, not touching, not performing anything for the room, and said quietly, "I should have asked you before I said it." She looked at him. "The part about my wife," he said. "I should have asked before I announced it to a room full of people." She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had loaded fabric in a September street and eaten stew at her small table and listened to the full weight of her sister's story without flinching, who had just stood up in the town hall of Red Hollow, Kansas, in front of everyone whose opinion had any bearing on his contracts, or his reputation, or his 11 years of built-up standing in this county, and announced his intentions without a flicker of hesitation. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He held her gaze. "I'm asking now." She thought about the coat, the weight of it, 4 years. "You're asking in a room full of people who are pretending to listen to road repair estimates," she said. "I know. That's terrible timing. I know that too." She looked at him. She thought about Rose's hand in hers, and the word daughter spoken in front of a silenced room, and the promise she had made to Sarah in a November hospital that smelled of carbolic and wood smoke. She thought about all the things that were still complicated, the story that still hadn't been told fully, the town that had made up its mind and would need to unmake it, the cost to his ranch that wasn't finished coming, all the messy, specific, unglamorous work of what came next. She thought, none of it has gone away. She thought, and I'm going to say yes anyway. "We'll discuss it later," she said, "when Thomas finishes the road schedule." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the front of the room. "Fair enough," he said, and they sat there together in the second-to-last row of the Red Hollow Town Hall, with the road repair estimates being read out and the room slowly reassembling itself around the ordinary business of a community, and Miriam felt the coat on her shoulders, still there, still heavy, but with the particular feeling of a weight that has been shared between 2 sets of hands, which does not make it lighter, exactly, but changes everything about how far you can carry it. The road repair estimates took another 40 minutes. Miriam sat through all of them with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on Thomas Reardon at the front of the room, and she was aware, in the peripheral and continuous way she'd become aware of such things over 4 years, of exactly how many people in the hall were doing the same thing she was, pointing their faces at Thomas while their attention was somewhere else entirely. Garrett sat beside her without fidgeting, without the restless energy of a man waiting for something to resolve itself. He had said what he came to say, and appeared to have made his peace with having said it, and the stillness of him was, she found, steadying in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. Rose had fallen asleep against Miriam's arm by the time the road schedule was finished. This was either a testament to the child's ability to sleep anywhere or to the particular soporific quality of Thomas Reardon discussing contractor bids, and Miriam suspected it was some of both. She sat with the warm weight of Rose against her shoulder and felt the room begin to move around them as the gathering broke up, and she braced for what was coming. What came first was Agnes Whitmore. Agnes was 52, the wife of the telegraph operator, a small woman with quick gray eyes who had been at the Women's Civic Society meeting and had given Nora the copy of the letter, and who was, Miriam had always thought, a fundamentally decent person operating inside a social structure that didn't always make decency easy. She stopped in front of them with the purposeful directness of someone who has decided to do something uncomfortable before they lose their nerve. "Miss Holloway," she said. Then, "Mr. Boone." She looked at Miriam. "What he said. What he said about the child being his daughter, and you being his wife." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "That was a good thing. That was the right kind of thing." She said it quickly, like she was getting it out before she could take it back, and then she nodded once and moved away before either of them could respond. Garrett watched her go. "That was something," he said quietly. "That was Agnes Whitmore deciding which side of a line she was on," Miriam said. "It cost her something. The society will hear about it by tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "Does that happen? People choosing sides?" "Sometimes." She shifted carefully so as not to wake Rose. "Not always the sides you expect." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miriam, we need to talk about what comes next." "I know. Not here." "No, not here." They left when Rose woke, which was another 10 minutes, and the child came out of sleep with her usual efficiency, blinking once and then sitting up straight and looking around like she'd only been resting her eyes. They walked out of the town hall together into the April evening, which had the particular quality of early spring evenings on the Kansas plain. Cold still, but with something underneath the cold that wasn't quite warmth yet, more the suggestion of it, the way the light lasted a few minutes longer each day, and you could feel the season considering its options. Dorothea Vance was on the steps. She was standing to the side, not blocking the way, not positioned for confrontation. She looked, Miriam thought, like a woman who had been standing there for a few minutes working up to something she wasn't sure she could manage. Her usual certainty was absent, and the absence of it made her look older. She looked at Miriam directly. Not at Garrett, at Miriam. "Miss Holloway." Her voice was not the voice she'd used inside. It had come down from the register of public declaration to something more ordinary and considerably less comfortable. "I owe you—" She stopped, pressed on. "What I asked in there, the way I asked it, in front of—" Her eyes moved briefly to Rose, and something in her face did something Miriam had never seen it do. That wasn't right. The steps of the Red Hollow Town Hall were not the setting Miriam would have chosen for this particular conversation, and Dorothea Vance was not the person she would have expected to be having it with. She stood with it for a moment. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Dorothea nodded, a short, compressed movement. She looked like she'd expected something harder, and wasn't sure what to do with having gotten something measured instead. She looked at Rose once more. The child was watching her with the frank, unself-conscious attention of someone who finds the adult world perpetually interesting. And then she walked down the steps and away, moving with slightly less certainty than she'd had going in. Rose watched her go. "What was that about?" she asked. "She was apologizing," Garrett said. Rose considered this. "She wasn't very good at it." "No," Miriam said. "But she did it." They walked back through the April evening, the three of them, and the street of Red Hollow lay around them quiet and rearranging itself in the specific way a small town rearranges itself after something public has happened that changes the shape of a story it thought it already knew. The conversation that needed to happen between Miriam and Garrett happened that night, after Rose was upstairs in bed with her book, and the shop was locked, and the lamp was low on the backroom table. It was not a romantic conversation. It was a practical one first, which was the only way either of them knew how to approach things that mattered. "If I tell the full story," Miriam said, "if I tell it publicly, the truth about Sarah, about the promise, it changes what the town thinks of me. But it also makes Rose's origins a public thing, a topic." She looked at the lamp flame. "Rose is 6. In a year she'll be 7. In 5 years, she'll be 11, and the children at school will have heard their parents talk about it, and they will bring it to her the way children bring things they've overheard. I know, Garrett said. I've thought about that. Have you? Since February, when you told me the story. He leaned forward on the table. There's no clean version. Telling it protects you, but it costs Rose something. Not telling it keeps protecting Rose, but it keeps costing you. That's the shape of it, she said. What does Rose want? Miriam looked at him. She heard enough on the staircase, he said. She knows there's a real story. She's 6, not helpless. What does she want? It was a question Miriam realized she hadn't asked directly. She had been so long in the habit of carrying things on behalf of Rose that asking Rose what she wanted about the weight of it felt strange. Felt like the kind of question you asked when the child was older, when the understanding was more complete. But she thought about Rose on the staircase. Rose saying she was my real mama without flinching. Rose saying, don't let her know shame, not saying those words, but being the living version of them. The child who had grown up without bowing her head, exactly as Sarah had asked. I'll ask her, Miriam said. Tomorrow. I'll ask her. What Rose said when Miriam sat across from her at the kitchen table the next morning, with the particular seriousness that the child always responded to with her own corresponding seriousness, was this. I don't want to be a secret. Miriam looked at her. Not my whole life, Rose said. She was eating a biscuit. She said it like it was a practical concern, not an emotional one, which was entirely Rose. If it's always a secret, then I always have to be careful about what I say. About her. She looked up. I want to be able to say my mother's name, my real mother, without having to explain everything around it. Miriam sat with that. Sarah? Rose said quietly, trying it. The name of the woman she'd never known, the woman who had named her Rose because roses were honest. I want to be able to say Sarah. Miriam's chest did the thing it did when the grief came up through the floor of the ordinary. She breathed through it. All right, she said. Is that what you want too? Rose asked. Miriam thought about 4 years of wearing a coat that wasn't hers. 4 years of back pews and customers without wrapping paper and mud on Rose's pinafore from the Prescott boy, and the specific loneliness of being in a place where no one knew the real shape of you. Yes, she said. I think it is. She told Garrett that afternoon. He listened, and then he said, when? Soon. She thought about Dorothea Vance on the steps, about Agnes Whitmore stopping in front of them with her quick gray eyes and saying that was the right kind of thing, like she was paying a debt she'd owed for a while. The moment is already starting to exist. I can feel it. The moment fully arrived on the following Saturday. Nora Jacobs had, without being asked and with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that some things needed a stage, mentioned to several of the right people that Miriam Holloway had something to say about the question Dorothea Vance had raised at the gathering. She'd done it in the dry goods store and at the post office and outside the bakery, which meant that by Saturday morning the information had distributed itself through Red Hollow's social network with the organic precision of something that looked like coincidence and was anything but. The Saturday market was fuller than the previous weeks. April had brought people out of the winter insularity that settled over the town between December and March, and the stalls were busy and the streets had the first real warmth of the season in them. Miriam arrived at 9 in the morning with Rose beside her, and Garrett was there already, at the same corner where he'd waited in December. Not in front of her shop, not staging it, just there. He looked at her when she came around the corner. She looked back. Ready? He said. No, she said, but we're doing it anyway. They found Thomas Reardon at the edge of the market near the produce stalls, because Thomas was the closest thing Red Hollow had to a neutral authority, and Miriam had decided that what she was about to do needed a witness who could be trusted to report it accurately. Thomas, she said, I'd like to say something to the people here, if you'd help me. Thomas Reardon had spent 20 years managing this town's public moments. He looked at her, looked at Garrett, looked at Rose, and said, all right, without asking for a preview. He moved to the center of the market and said, in the carrying voice he used for gatherings, that Miss Holloway had something to say, and he'd asked people to give her a moment of their time. The market didn't stop immediately. It slowed, the way a room slows when something shifts the air pressure. People finished their sentences and turned. The man selling dried corn paused his pitch. Two women near the jam stand turned with the expression of people who had been told this might happen and had positioned themselves accordingly. Miriam stood in the center of the market on a Saturday morning in April, with the spring sun on her face and Rose's hand in hers and Garrett standing slightly behind her, present, but not in front of her, not making it about him, which was the right instinct, and she'd known he'd have it. And she looked at the people of Red Hollow who had been looking at her for 4 years, and she told the truth. All of it. She told it clean, without performance, without the practiced smoothness of someone who has rehearsed. She told it like she'd told it to Garrett in the shop in February, that the hospital, the promise, the decision to come to Red Hollow and let the town build its story, because the story they built kept Rose's origins out of the center of it. She told them about Sarah. She said her sister's name. She said it twice, because it deserved to be said twice in public, in a place that had never known it existed. She said that she had made a choice 4 years ago and she would make it again. She said she was not asking for their understanding and she was not apologizing. She said she was telling the truth because her daughter, she paused on the word and let it land and looked at Rose, had asked to be able to say her mother's name without carrying the weight of other people's assumptions about it. Then she stopped. The market was very quiet. The spring wind moved through it with the indifference wind always has to human affairs, touching the cloth on the stalls and the women's hair and the dried corn and everything equally, and Miriam stood in the center of it and let the quiet be what it was. Dorothea Vance was there. She was standing near the edge of the crowd, and her face was doing the thing it had been doing on the steps of the town hall, that internal reorganization, the adjustment of a woman who had built a position on a story and was now holding the actual story in her hands and feeling the difference in weight. Gerald Prescott was there too, at the back of the gathered people, and his face was the face of a man who has been maneuvering against a thing and has just discovered that the thing he was maneuvering against no longer exists in the form he was maneuvering against. His leverage had been the ambiguity, the secrecy, the story the town had made up in the absence of a real one. Miriam had just handed the real one to every person in the market, and the real one made the made-up one look exactly like what it was. A cruelty built on a lie of omission by people who had never had the honesty to ask a direct question and had never examined why. What happened next was not dramatic. It was not a single moment of redemption or a collective acknowledgement. That was not how small towns worked, and Miriam had never expected it to be. What happened was smaller and more real, and in its own way, more significant. Agnes Whitmore walked through the crowd to where Miriam was standing and said, clearly enough for the people nearby to hear, "I'm sorry, Miss Holloway, for the things I let happen without saying anything." She didn't wait for a response. She went back to the jam stand and started looking at preserves with great concentration. Thomas Reardon said in his carrying voice, "Thank you, Miss Holloway," and then turned back to the market and said something about the spring corn prices that gave everyone who needed an ordinary thing to do an ordinary thing to do. A woman Miriam barely knew, the wife of one of the farmers from the north side of the county, a woman who had been in her shop exactly once, came and bought a length of ribbon she clearly didn't need and said, while paying for it, "You do good work here," meaning more than the ribbon, and left. Nora appeared beside her. She didn't say anything. She stood there with Miriam for a moment, in the way old friends stand next to each other when standing there is the thing that's needed. And then she said, "Come have coffee when the market's done," and went back to her stall. Rose had been standing through all of this with her hand in Miriam's, watching. When the crowd had dispersed back into the ordinary business of the market and they were standing in a little space that had opened up around them, Rose turned and looked up at Miriam. "You said Sarah," she said. "Yes." "In front of everyone?" "Yes." Rose looked at the market going on around them. She looked at Gerald Prescott, who had turned away and was examining a display of seed packets with excessive attention. She looked at Dorothea Vance, who was moving through the crowd with the look of a woman reconsidering the architecture of her opinions. She looked at all of it with those quick, Sarah's eyes, the eyes that noticed things before they were said. "It feels different," Rose said. "What does?" "Being here. The market." She thought about it. "It feels like we live here now, before it felt like we were just in it." Miriam looked at her daughter, both meanings of that word, and neither one insufficient. "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." Garrett had been standing back. He came forward now, not intruding on it, just arriving at the natural moment. He looked at Rose first, the way he'd learned to look at her, with attention, not performance. "How are you?" he said to the child. "Good," Rose said. She considered him. "You can walk with us now, if you want. I don't think people will stare as much." "I'll risk it either way," he said. "I know," she said. "But now it'll be easier." She looked at Miriam. "Can we look at the livestock?" "We can," Miriam said. They moved through the Saturday market together, the three of them, and the market moved around them the way markets do. Busy, self-interested, the ordinary life of a community going about its business. And Miriam felt the watching still, because the watching didn't stop in a day or a Saturday or a single public truth-telling. But its character had changed. It was no longer the watching of a town that had decided what it thought and was checking to confirm it. It was the watching of a place that had been handed a different story than the one it had been telling itself, and was in the slow, uncomfortable, necessary process of adjustment. That process had no clean ending. Miriam knew that. Gerald Prescott would not become a different man by Tuesday. Dorothea Vance would not dismantle 4 years of social machinery in an afternoon. The children at school who had gotten the old story from their parents would carry some version of it for years yet, and Rose would encounter it in forms Miriam couldn't predict or fully protect against. But the coat was off. She felt it the way you feel the absence of something you've worn so long you'd forgotten it was separate from you. Not relief exactly, more a kind of disorientation, the particular strangeness of moving without a weight that had become part of how you understood your own movement. She felt lighter, and also somehow more exposed, which was the honest cost of removing armor you'd needed and no longer needed, and couldn't be entirely sure you didn't still need. Garrett walked beside her. He didn't say anything profound. He didn't say anything at all, for a stretch of the market, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that meant something by being easy. Rose had found the livestock pen and was already at the fence rail with her paper and her pencil, asking the farmer next to her something about the new spring lambs, with the focused urgency of someone who needs this information for cartographic purposes. Miriam stood and watched her niece, Sarah's daughter, her daughter, lean on the fence rail with total self-possession, asking her questions, taking her notes, building her map of the world one piece at a time. "Don't let her grow up bowing her head at anyone," Sarah had said, in a hospital room in November, with thin hands and carbolic in the air. Miriam looked at Rose at the fence rail. Her head was up. It had always been up. The promise was kept. The weeks after the market had the particular quality of an aftermath. Not peaceful exactly, but decompressed, the way a room feels after a long argument has finally said everything it needed to say, and the air is clearing itself out. Red Hollow didn't change overnight. Miriam had never expected it to, and the fact that she hadn't expected it made the changes that did come feel more real rather than less. They arrived in small increments, the way most real things arrive. Not in the form of dramatic reversals, but in the form of small adjustments, small admissions, the quiet recalibrations of people who have been handed a different story than the one they'd been working from and are doing the private work of revising. Mrs. Calloway came in for her May dresses and for the first time in 4 years took the wrapping paper. She didn't comment on it. She didn't offer anything like an apology, which Miriam neither expected nor needed from her. But she took the wrapping paper, tucked it under her arm with the burgundy wool and the gray visiting gown, and said on her way out, "Same quality as always, Miss Holloway," in a tone that had lost the particular careful distance of the previous 4 years. It wasn't warmth, but it was the absence of the cold, and Miriam filed that under the category of things that mattered without requiring ceremony. The Prescott boys stopped throwing mud. Miriam didn't know whether this was Ida Prescott's doing or Gerald's, or whether the child had simply absorbed the shift in the atmosphere the way children absorb such things. Through the conversations they overheard, the adjustments in their parents' voices when certain names came up, the general recalibration of what the adults around them deemed acceptable to perform. Whatever the mechanism, Rose came home from school on a Tuesday in May with her pinafore clean and a slightly puzzled expression. "He just didn't," she said when Miriam asked. "He just looked at me and then looked somewhere else. Is that all right with you?" Rose considered it with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I think so. It's not the same as him actually being sorry." No, Miriam agreed. It's not. But it's better than mud. Considerably. Rose went back to her map, which had expanded considerably since January. New territories, new farms, a section in the upper right corner that she'd labeled places I haven't decided about yet in her careful, slightly tilted handwriting. Miriam looked at it sometimes when Rose wasn't in the room and thought about Sarah, who had wanted her daughter to know the world was large. It was getting larger by the week, that map. It was becoming something substantial. The question Garrett had asked in the town hall, imperfectly timed, announced before it was asked, and exactly right in every way that mattered, was answered formally on an evening in late May, in the back room of the shop with the lamp low and Rose pointedly in the kitchen making a pot of tea she'd decided she needed to make immediately and with great concentration. There was no ring. Garrett had thought about it and decided he'd rather ask first and choose it together, which was either practical or romantic depending on how you looked at it, and was, Miriam thought, entirely characteristic of a man who understood that some decisions deserved to be genuinely shared rather than presented. "I'm asking properly this time," he said, "without a room full of people." I noticed. He looked at her across the table, the same table where they'd eaten stew in December, where Rose had laid out her paper map and asked him about territories he'd traveled. There was nothing performed about him, no construction of the moment, just a man at a table looking at a woman he'd decided he wanted to spend his life with and saying so. "Miriam Holloway," he said, "will you marry me?" He said it without the upward inflection of a question, which she noticed and which was accurate. It was less a question than a proposal of terms, laid out by a man who had already made his position known to an entire town, and was now making it known to her, cleanly, without decoration. She looked at him. She thought about September and a pair of hands picking up a bolt of fabric from a dusty street without being asked. She thought about December stew and February truth-telling and April snow. She thought about a man who had stood up in a town hall and said daughter and wife without hesitation, and who had then quietly noted afterward that he should have asked first. "Yes," she said. From the kitchen came the sound of a teapot being set down with slightly more force than was strictly necessary, followed by the sound of Rose not saying anything, which was louder in its way than if she'd said something. Garrett looked toward the kitchen doorway. "She knew I was going to ask," he said. "Of course she did. She's been making that tea for 20 minutes. She's been waiting for us to finish so she can come back in the room." Miriam raised her voice slightly. "Rose." The child appeared in the doorway with her mug of tea and the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and considers that patience to have been earned. "Well?" she said. "Yes," Miriam said. Rose nodded once, with the gravity of a person confirming information they already had but needed to hear officially. She came back to the table and sat down and wrapped both hands around her mug and said to Garrett, "You should know I snore. Miriam says it's not loud, but she's being polite." Garrett looked at Miriam. "She does snore," Miriam confirmed. "It's not loud." "Good to know," he said. They were married in September, on a Thursday, because Thursdays were when the shop was quietest, and Miriam saw no reason to close for a full Saturday on account of a wedding. The ceremony was at the courthouse, conducted by Judge Harlan, who was 70 years old and had married more couples in this county than he could readily count, and had developed a version of the legal words that was short, clear, and had the particular quality of something that meant what it said. Nora Jacobs was there. Agnes Whitmore came, which surprised Miriam somewhat and moved her more than she'd expected. Thomas Reardon came, which didn't surprise her at all. A handful of others, people who had been making their quiet recalculations since April, people who wanted to be on the right side of a thing they'd gotten wrong, stood in the small room of the courthouse on a September Thursday and watched Garrett Boone and Miriam Holloway make each other a set of promises. Rose stood between them. She had refused, firmly and without apology, to stand to the side. She stood between them and held both their hands during the words, which was not technically part of the proceedings, but which Judge Harlan, who had seen a great many things in 70 years, allowed without comment. When it was done, Rose looked up at Garrett and said, with the directness that had always been the most Sarah thing about her, "Do I call you Papa now, or is that strange?" Garrett looked at her for a moment. His face did something. Not the composed look he usually wore, but something underneath it, the actual feeling showing through for a moment the way it did sometimes when he wasn't managing it back in time. "That's up to you," he said. "Whatever feels right." Rose thought about it. "I'll try it," she said, "and see if it fits." It fit. They all knew it would, but it mattered that she'd decided it herself. The ranch was 20 miles southwest of town, and Miriam kept the shop. This was not a negotiation so much as a conversation in which Garrett said, "The shop is yours. It makes sense for you to keep it." And Miriam said, "I'm not closing it." And Garrett said, "I know." And that was the end of that particular discussion. She drove in 3 days a week, which was more driving than she'd done in her life until that point, and which she was, within 2 months, entirely accustomed to. Rose went to school on the days Miriam was in town and spent the other days at the ranch, which she treated as an extension of her map project. The ranch was, it turned out, more interesting to a child with cartographic ambitions than a shop on Main Street had been. There were horses to study and acreage to measure, and a creek that ran along the western edge of the property that changed its course slightly every spring, which Rose considered a personal challenge. She made a detailed map of the property by the end of October that was accurate enough that Garrett used it to explain to a new hand where the fence lines were, which Rose accepted as the highest possible compliment, and tacked it to the wall of her room at the ranch with considerable satisfaction. Her room at the ranch. That was a thing that took some time to feel ordinary, the way new things take time. Rose had her corner stool at the shop and her room above it, and she also had a room at the ranch with a window that faced east and got the morning light, and she divided her time between them with the adaptability of a child who had learned early that home was not a single fixed location, but something you carried in yourself and could set down in more than one place. Miriam watched this adaptation with a feeling she couldn't always name cleanly. Pride was part of it. Relief was part of it, and something else, something that was connected to the promise, to the hospital room, to Sarah's thin hands and the word shame that they had both agreed to refuse. Rose moved through the world with her head up, the way Sarah had asked. She moved through it like someone who had been told that the world was hers to understand and had taken that information seriously. The shop on Main Street was different that winter. Not transformed. Miriam was not a person who believed in transformation as a category, but different in the specific ways that resulted from a specific change. The customers who came were no longer divided into the 3 camps she'd spent 4 years navigating. The division was simpler now and, in some ways, more honest. There were people who came because she did good work, and there were 1 or 2 who didn't come at all, and the ones who didn't come were doing her no injustice by staying away because she didn't need their business to maintain what she'd built. What she'd built was, she thought sometimes, looking around the shop on a winter morning with the stove going and the steam rising from the iron and the particular smell of pressed wool and beeswax that had been the smell of this place for 5 years. What she'd built was something she hadn't known she was building when she started it. She'd come to Red Hollow to disappear, in a sense, to create a story that was small enough and unremarkable enough to keep Rose out of a worse one. She'd built a life instead, a real one, with the texture that real lives have. The inconvenient parts, and the hard parts, and the parts where you got it wrong and had to figure out how to get it less wrong. Dorothea Vance came into the shop in November. This was unexpected. In 5 years, Dorothea had never set foot in Miriam's shop. She had sent her requests through intermediaries, paid in notes delivered by her housekeeper, maintained the particular distance of a woman who wanted good dresses made by skilled hands but didn't want to be seen wanting them. She came in on a Tuesday morning in November and stood at the counter with the same directness she brought to everything, but with something held differently in her body. A contained quality. A person who has come to do something that costs something and has decided to pay the cost. "Mrs. Boone," she said, using the name, which was its own statement. "Mrs. Vance." Dorothea set her hands on the counter. "I need a dress for the winter gathering, something suitable." A pause. A breath that was just slightly larger than an ordinary breath. "And I owe you more than I'm able to say properly. I know that. I'm saying it anyway." Miriam looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had demanded answers in a public room and signed a letter designed to isolate and had stood on the steps of the town hall afterward looking like someone confronting the gap between who they'd thought they were and who they'd actually been. People who got things wrong and then came back to say so deserved something for the coming back. Not absolution. That wasn't Miriam's to give. and she had no interest in the giving of it, but acknowledgement, recognition that the coming back cost something and they'd paid it. "What color?" Miriam said. Dorothea blinked. "I thought perhaps a deep green." "For winter, that's good. Come back Thursday for measurements." It wasn't forgiveness. It was also not the closed door it could have been, and both of them understood the difference. Dorothea Vance left the shop with the slightly lighter posture of a woman who has paid a bill she'd owed for a long time and is recalibrating accordingly. Gerald Prescott never came to say anything. Miriam hadn't expected him to, and she bore him no particular resentment for the absence of it, because resentment takes energy, and she had things to do with her energy that she found considerably more interesting. What she noticed over the winter months was that his influence over the social temperature of Red Hollow had diminished in some way that was difficult to quantify, but real. When you build your position on a story and the story turns out to be wrong, the position doesn't immediately collapse, but it develops cracks, and the cracks spread quietly, and people begin to feel them under their feet and make small adjustments in where they stand. One of Garrett's contract partners came back in January with a larger order than before. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. There was a particular Sunday in February, deep winter, the flat iron gray sky and the cold that had become familiar, almost comfortable, in the way of a thing you've survived enough times to stop fearing. When Garrett and Miriam and Rose went out to check the eastern fence line, which had come down in a wind 3 days before. They drove out in the wagon, the three of them, Rose between them on the seat with her coat buttoned to the chin and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. And when they got to the fence, Garrett got down to assess the damage, and Rose got down immediately after him because she always did. And Miriam sat on the wagon seat and watched them walk the fence line together, the man and the child, Garrett pointing out something about the post that had given way, and Rose asking a question and then asking another question, and then pulling out her paper from her coat pocket to make a note of something. She thought about the map on the back wall of the shop in Red Hollow, the one Rose had started when she was 6. The chalk lines and the territory markers and the places she was going to go someday. She thought about all the places on that map that had been filled in since: the ranch, the fence line, the creek that changed course in spring, the north road to the sheep farms that Garrett had told her about one afternoon at the livestock pen. She thought about Sarah, who had wanted her daughter to know that the world was large. The world on Rose's map was very large now. It was getting larger. It would keep getting larger for a long time, in ways that neither Miriam nor Garrett nor Rose could predict. And that was exactly right. Garrett looked back at her from the fence line. Just a look. The kind you give someone when you're checking in, when you want to confirm that they're there and everything is all right, and no more than that. The ordinary look of a person who has built a life with someone and keeps checking that the building is holding. She nodded once. He turned back to the fence. Rose was already writing. It wasn't a happy ending in the clean, finished sense that endings sometimes pretend to be. Gerald Prescott still ran his cattle operation and had his brothers on their respective boards, and would, in all likelihood, continue to be the loudest man in most rooms he entered until he was too old to manage it. The Women's Civic Society still met the second Thursday of the month, and the social machinery of Red Hollow still turned with all the particular efficiency of small-town opinion, and there would be days when some version of something that had happened before would surface in some new form, because that was the nature of communities and of people, and of all the accumulated habits a place builds up over decades of being what it is. Rose would hit those days. She would encounter the residue of the story at school, in conversations she overheard, in the way certain people said her name with a slightly different inflection than they said other names. Miriam knew this and couldn't prevent it, and had done, she thought, the most she could do. Given the child a real story to stand on, told her the real name of the woman who had loved her before she knew what love was, and let her understand that the shame people had tried to place on her had never been hers to carry. Miriam herself would have days when the 4 years felt closer than they should, when she'd be pressing a seam in the shop and she'd remember the back pew, the customers without wrapping paper, Rose's face after a day at school when the Prescott boy had made his opinions known. Memory didn't expire just because its source had changed. It just changed its meaning over time, if you let it. What she'd decided, somewhere between February and that September Thursday at the courthouse, was that the years she'd spent wearing the coat were not years she'd wasted or years she'd been defeated. They were years she'd spent keeping a promise. They were years she'd spent building something. Herself, the shop, Rose's confidence, the quiet knowledge that she could carry an enormous weight for an enormous time and come out on the other side with her head still up. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing she found herself most sure of. When she was honest with herself in the way she could only be honest in the dark or in the early morning when the shop was cold and the stove was still coming up to temperature and the day hadn't organized itself into tasks yet. She had done something hard. She had done it alone for a long time, and then she had let someone help her carry it, and then she had set it down in the middle of a Saturday market in April while the spring wind moved through indifferent and equal, and she had walked away from it into the life she'd been slowly, quietly, stubbornly building underneath it the whole time. Garrett fixed the fence post. Rose made her notes. The wagon sat on the frozen February ground with the horse patient and breathing in the cold, and the sky above the Kansas plain was the particular gray of a winter afternoon that has a few more hours left in it and hasn't decided yet what to do with them. When they climbed back on the wagon, Rose pushed herself between them again and said, with no particular preamble, "I'm going to add the creek to the south side of the map, the part where it bends." "You'll need to measure it in spring," Garrett said. "When the water's up, you can see where the actual bank is." "Can we go in April?" "We can go in April. I'll bring the good paper." "Bring a coat too," Miriam said. "April on that creek is cold." "I know," Rose said, with the tolerance of a person who has been told to bring a coat before and will bring the coat and doesn't need reminding but accepts the reminding as the form of love it is. They drove back toward the ranch in the February afternoon, the three of them on the wagon seat with Rose between them, and behind them the fence line was repaired, and ahead of them the ranch sat low and solid against the gray sky. And the road between was ordinary and frozen and entirely theirs. Sarah Holloway had died in November 4 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of carbolic, and she had asked her sister not to let her daughter grow up bowing her head at anyone, and her sister had kept the promise and paid the cost and come out the other side. Rose Boone was 7 years old. Her head was up. It had always been up. It would stay that way. Not because the world would stop trying to put it down, because the world didn't work like that and never had, but because the women who had made her, and the woman who had raised her, and the man who had chosen her for his daughter had all understood, each in their own way, the same essential thing, that you don't earn your place in the world by making yourself small enough that no one objects to your presence. You earn it by being exactly who you are, for exactly the reasons you know to be true, and letting that be sufficient. It was sufficient. The wagon moved through the February cold toward home. The map kept growing.
Where the hell are the fucking fire exits? Gotta be like one over here, right? Oh, yeah. Oh, yep. There we go. Ah, fuck you! Ugh, what the fuck was in there, man? Hopefully they've dedicated a fucking task force just sitting in the base. Okay. Well, that is very not good. So... Oh! Oh! There's a... Ah! Guys! They're everywhere! Ah! Dude, there's like 2 jaguars. Be careful. One's on the
Oh, Jen, there you might be fucked.